Welcome back to the channel. This is Trendy Storm, and you are watching second and final part of What If God Naruto Saved Edward. If you enjoy this video, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Not wasting no time. Let's start the story.
I can smell you. Scar accelerated, a rare wave of terror coursing through him as the beast behind him let out a crazed scream. As it sailed over his body, Scar barely avoided Gluttony's jaws before leaping forward, his years of combat experience saving his life. As his wounded leg struck the hard cobblestones of the sewer, Scar moaned in agony. He glanced up as the creature spun around and charged at him, drooling and frothing its mouth. Scar rolled to the side, narrowly escaping the creature as it slammed into the sewer wall. The impact had apparently been powerful enough to cave it in, as the creature pulled its head out of the wall, red lighting arcing around its skull. It turned to face Scar and began stalking him once more, much more slowly this time. Scar stood up and began to flee, but a piece of the wall clipped his injured leg, knocking him back to the ground. He turned to face Gluttony, who was removing yet another, considerably larger piece of the wall. The creature said to itself, if it doesn't move, then Gluttony will be able to eat it, after successfully pulling out a rock fragment that was roughly half as big as Scar. Yes. And then Lust will be happy with Gluttony, and Gluttony will be able to eat even more. Scar gave Gluttony a horrified glance before noticing a waterspout emerging from the spot where Gluttony had ripped the wall. Scar pressed his ear against the sewer wall while Gluttony babbled to itself about how delicious the little Ishvalan would be. He could indeed hear the water rushing. Now, little Ishvalan, die, exclaimed Gluttony, throwing the stone with his rear arm. With nothing else to do, Scar pressed his right hand against the sewer wall. The corridor was completely illuminated by blue lighting. There was a rumbling sound coming from the sewer, and Gluttony looked down. Scar and Gluttony were swept away into the relentless currents of the sewer as its walls collapsed and over 10,000 gallons of water poured in, leaving Gluttony with nothing to do but scream. As the train he was traveling on passed the eastern Amestris fields and meadows, Ed's gaze was fixed on the quickly shifting landscape. Naruto was sitting across from him, jokingly sketching out ideas for his next book. Ed let out a sigh and turned to face his companion. When Ed said, I still don't understand why Mustang sent you with me, his voice was laced with annoyance. Armstrong closed his copy of Makeout Paradise after giving Ed a quick glance. Armstrong opened his book again and answered, Mustang sent me to guard you and Alphonse. If an associate of Scar were to attack you too, you'd be nearly defenseless. Ed said, horrified, I also can't believe how you can read that trash, Colonel, as he peered at the little orange book in Armstrong's hands. Genuinely surprised, Armstrong turned to face Ed before getting to his feet and striking an intriguing pose. Armstrong raised his book as if it were a sacred artifact and exclaimed, you would dare mock a literary masterpiece such as this? You would call that smut a literary masterpiece? Ed asked, his astonishment evident. Why yes. Of course I would, Armstrong cried, his enthusiasm overpowering the volume of his voice. It reflects the best in masculinity, iterating the cycle of birth and death with masterful precision. Ed's wide, incredulous eyes were fixed on Armstrong. Ed turned back to his window and pressed his forehead against the glass, but he did not respond. After laughing at Ed's bad luck, Naruto turned to face Armstrong, who had reclined in his chair and taken out his book for the third time. Naruto said, so, Mr. Armstrong, since you were guarding Ed, I assume that you are a state alchemist, and put his notebook inside his jacket. That is correct, replied Armstrong, chuckling, I am Alex Lewis Armstrong, the Armstrong alchemist, practitioner of the Armstrong alchemy, which has been passed down the Armstrong family for generations. As he finished his title, Armstrong got to his feet and posed in the strong man position. I see, said Naruto, who didn't seem to mind Armstrong's exaggerated speech. Then I would guess that your alchemy is combat-oriented. That is correct once again. My alchemy is the perfect combination of raw strength and finesse, accompanied by precise transmutations to construct anything with the simple punch of the fist. As he spoke, Armstrong took out a piece of chalk and drew a complex transmutation circle on their cabin table. Armstrong raised his fist at the conclusion of his speech and punched the middle of the table. The table was obscured from view by the intense light that filled it. When it resurfaced, the center of the cabin was a flawless sculpture of Armstrong's head in place of a table. Ed and Naruto stared in shock at the head. What the hell, Armstrong? We have to pay for that, exclaimed Ed. Nonesense, responded Armstrong. Now everyone will be able to view my glorious visage for all of eternity. But they won't be able to use the table, exclaimed Ed, clearly irritated. Armstrong raised his hand to his chin. Armstrong said matter of factly, yes, that is quite unfortunate. I guess I shall just have to rectify my mistake. Then Armstrong lifted his fist and struck the table once more. When it was visible once more, Ed let out a frustrated cry, and Naruto chuckled as blue light engulfed it. There was a table in front of them, but it was bright gold and had tiny Armstrongs in different work positions adorning the side. It was as flamboyant as it could be and had a strikingly Greek architectural appearance. "Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't it illegal to make gold alchemically?" asked Naruto. "Yes," Armstrong answered, "but that's pyrite, not gold." "Fool's gold," Naruto said. Ed sighed and said, "I still think they'll charge us for the table," before going back to his window. Naruto said, "You can afford it," and he turned to face Armstrong. Naruto bowed his head to the bigger man and said, "Thank you for your explanation. It was most enlightening. But I must ask, why are you so free with your alchemy? Aren't you afraid of someone possibly stealing it?" Armstrong gave a headshake. "As I said earlier, my alchemy requires a perfect combination of strength and finesse, both of which I have spent my entire life honing. If there was someone who could match me physically and combatively, then they deserve to learn my alchemy." Naruto's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "In that case, I challenge you to a spar when we reach Rezembul," Naruto replied. Armstrong gave Naruto a quick glance before nodding and grinning. "I will expect it. Our battle will be a very young undertaking," Armstrong answered. Naruto jerked up, then gave Armstrong a disbelieving look. "What did you just say?" Naruto asked in a low voice. Perplexed, Armstrong said, "I said our fight would be a most youthful endeavor." Still silent, Naruto questioned, "Is that something you say often?" Armstrong raised a thoughtful hand to his chin and then shook his head negatively. "No, I would have to say that this is the first time I have actually said that," Armstrong replied. "Although, I do like how it sounds. I may use it in the future." "Is something wrong, Naruto?" Ed asked in concern. "No," Naruto shook his head in response. It was a phrase a dear friend of mine had used, a long time ago." Armstrong gave Naruto the thumbs up and said, "In that case, I shall use it in honor of this, most youthful, friend of yours." Naruto gave Armstrong an even more incredulous look before nodding absently and reclining in his chair. Then Naruto appeared to recall something. Naruto asked, "Hey Ed, where's Al?" Ed stuck his thumb at Armstrong as he gave him an irritated look. This guy decided that Al needed some company, so instead of bringing Al in here with us, he put Al in the cargo car filled with sheep. Armstrong folded his arms and said, "I thought he would need some company, and I very well couldn't bring a disembodied hunk of armor onto the train car with us," in an almost childlike way. Ed exclaimed, "That hunk of armor is my brother," in further annoyance at Armstrong's casual reply. Before a loud bell notified the passengers that the next train station was approaching, Naruto chuckled. "I am pretty sure that this is our stop," Naruto said, extending his arms. Ed said, "It is," and he stood up, reaching under his seat to retrieve his suitcase. Armstrong did the same, but his suitcase was in an overhead compartment. "I don't suppose you guys would want to get some lunch?" asked Naruto. "I'm famished." "I'm up for it. How about you, Colonel?" Armstrong retorted, and Armstrong is always able to eat. Naruto said, "Good, and I know Al won't object to being out and about after 5 hours inside a sheep pen," while Ed gave Armstrong a stern look. When the train began to slow, they got up, and soon they were stopped in front of Soli train station, which was the first and only train station in the tiny farming community of Soli. The four of them disembarked from the train, picked up Al, and headed for Soli proper, Armstrong carrying Al in a shipping crate. But as they were leaving the station, Armstrong yelled and gestured to a man about 30 feet away who was carrying some groceries. Armstrong waved at the man and exclaimed, "Dr. Marco, is that you?" After giving Armstrong a quick glance, the man dropped his groceries and took off running. Marco had already turned the corner of the street and disappeared before they could even begin to pursue him. Turning, Naruto faced Armstrong. Shuffling in his new boots, Naruto asked, "Who was that, and do you want me to catch him?" "That man was Tim Marco, or at least looked like him," Armstrong said, clearly experiencing some sort of distress. He was one of the military's top researchers during the Ishvalan War, as well as one of the leading minds in the possible medical application of alchemy. However, he was said to have disappeared, taking all of his research with him. We have not been able to find him since. What was your relationship with him? If you could recognize him at a glance, that would suggest that you spent a great deal of time with the man, replied Naruto. He was my psychiatrist, Armstrong answered. I thought you said he was a top researcher, Ed said, highlighting the apparent inconsistency. Armstrong glanced down at Ed. Armstrong turned to Naruto and sighed, saying, "Leave him alone. We'll find him again. No need to frighten him. I was his only patient." Naruto simply put his hands in his pockets and shrugged. Naruto replied, "Okay, as you said, we'll find him eventually." He then proceeded to retrieve the doctor's groceries. "Just remember, eventually can be an awfully long time," he said, taking an apple from it, biting into it, and turning to the three. Armstrong displayed the drawing he had done of Marco, which surprisingly captured the elderly physician. After looking at the photo, the store owner from whom they had just purchased lunch nodded. The shopkeeper said, "That's Dr. Morrow. He lives outside town, about a mile east of the train station. You're not gonna try to do anything to the good doctor, are you?" The man scowled. "Absolutely not. He's just an old acquaintance of mine, who I saw my way in, but unfortunately, could not contact." "Good, because that doctor has done nothing but good for us since he moved here, and we would like it to stay like that." Armstrong tucked the photo back into his blue military coat after giving a nod. Ed and Naruto were eating big sandwiches when he turned to face them. Al asked from his spot on Armstrong's shoulder, "May I see the picture, Mr. Armstrong?" Armstrong said, "Certainly," as he reached back into his coat and took out the photo, displaying it to Al. Al said, "Wow, Mr. Armstrong, you are very talented, it looks just like him." Armstrong responded, "The Armstrong family has been practicing portraiture for generations, as though it were instinctive." Ed said, his voice muffled by a sandwich, "Well, since we have found out where he lives, want to go over and see if he's home?" Armstrong said gravely, "Yes, I would really like to have Marco answer a few of my questions." "After you have the answers to those questions, what are your plans for him? He is, by definition, a deserter," Naruto asked. "If you were to abide by military law, you would have to either kill him if you couldn't find a peaceful solution or capture him until he could be sentenced." Armstrong's face was frowning as he glanced down at Naruto. Without saying another word, Armstrong made his way to the train station and, eventually, Dr. Morrow's house. That is a dark thought indeed, one that will be dictated by Marco's answers. 1 mile east of Soli train station, Armstrong knocked on the door of Dr. Morrow's house, and a moment later heard the definite sound of bolts sliding behind the door, but he was unable to speak because the man they were looking for was holding a gun barrel in front of him. "All right, what are you doing here, Armstrong? Are you here to return me? Because you're a dead man if you are," the frightened doctor said. Armstrong placatingly raised his hands and shook his head. "No, doctor, that is not why I am here," Armstrong said coolly. "Now, please put down the GU." Marco was in the middle of saying, "Then you are here to kill me. Don't think I won't kill you because I was your fucking psychiatrist, when his pistol was taken from him with force. The barrel of Marco's gun appeared under his chin as a voice spoke from behind him. "You know, Mr. Marco," Naruto said, "it is unwise to threaten my friends." With a nod, Marco's breathing became a little difficult. "Are you going to listen to Armstrong and be polite now?" Marco gave another nod. "Good." After grinning and coughing up blood onto the doctor's shoulder, Armstrong and Ed hurried over to Naruto, who was swaying violently. Marco turned and gave his attacker a brief glance before allowing his medical instincts to take over. After taking Naruto by the hand and guiding him to a chair at his kitchen table, Marco put his hand on Naruto's chest, which started to glow a green that seemed almost herbal. A moment later, he removed his hand and turned to face Naruto in surprise. "How on earth was that?" Ed asked, completely perplexed by the doctor's actions. Marco sighed after glancing at Ed. "I scanned his body using alchemy," Marco replied, "and what I found was quite disturbing." "Hold on. How did you scan his body?" Ed cut him off. "That kind of usefulness ought to be standard in alchemy nowadays, doesn't it?" With a nod, Marco shook his head and turned to face Naruto, who was breathing a little more easily. Marco put his hand back on Naruto's chest and said, "I have no doubt it would be, but the price of learning is too high. In alchemy, there are 3 phases," Marco continued, inhaling deeply. "Yeah," Ed replied, "understanding, deconstruction, reconstruction." "That's right," Marco said, feeling his hand turn green as he moved it to Naruto's arms. "When I touch the flesh, I comprehend, then I disassemble and reassemble the cells in the same arrangement that they were in, which essentially gives me a mental picture of the body and the afflicted areas, even if they are internal," Marco said. After removing his hand from Naruto's chest, Marco gave him a scathing look. "Young man," Marco said, making Naruto grin. "What the hell did you do to your lungs? In addition to being nearly entirely collapsed, your left lung is missing almost 25% of its length. I have no idea how you managed to breathe, much less move so quickly." The phrase, "young man," still made Naruto smile. Naruto wiped some of the blood from his mouth and replied, "I've had a rather strenuous life up until now. I haven't met someone who can fix my lungs, but I am quite capable of many things, despite their state of being. Furthermore, conventional methods cannot precisely heal them. After giving Naruto a disbelieving glance, Marco reached into his pocket. So it wouldn't bother you if I tried to get at them? I can assure you, my methods are anything but conventional, Marco said, taking his hand out of his pocket, which appeared to be holding something. Actually, I would mind, Naruto said, tensing up a little. If you don't remember, I was holding a gun up to your head a few moments ago, he said. Marco gave Naruto a quick glance before grinning a little. As Marco states, sir, I'm not a dangerous person by nature, but if it satisfies you, I will allow you to shoot me. He is clearly aware of something. His eyes seemed to light up with understanding as Naruto glanced at Marco, then raised the gun and drew the slide back to peer into the chamber, took the magazine out of Marco's gun, and then laughed. There was nothing in the magazine. What if we were here to arrest you, really? Al asked over Armstrong's shoulder. Marco was shocked to see that the armor could talk, and he turned to face Al. Marco stared at Al, slowly realizing that the eye slots in the armor were glowing red, but he was unable to form words. Both Ed and Al let out a sigh. Doctor, meet my brother, Alphonse Elric, Ed said, raising his hand as though he were introducing an attraction. After glancing at the two, Marco took a deep breath. You both broke the taboo? Unbelievingly, Marco breathed. Both brothers gave a nod. After making a strangled noise, Marco staggered back a little as if his legs were going weak. Placing his hand to his face and blotting away imaginary perspiration, Marco said, but, you two are so young. Did you see it? Ed gave Marco a startled look before nodding slowly. Marco's face went completely white as he collapsed, seemingly overwhelmed by the information the brothers were giving him. What did you discover? Marco asked in a quiet voice. What are you saying? Dazed by Marco's inquiry, Ed asked. He turned to face Ed, or rather, Ed's arm and leg, and said, when one passes through the gate, he bestows upon them the gift of information and knowledge that would usually take a lifetime to accumulate, but at a price. Marco sighed, but Ed literally jolted him out of his reverie by running up to him, grabbing him by the shirt, and lifting him up. He gifted me with the analyzing alchemy I just showed you, as well as great amounts of knowledge pertaining to the creation of the celestial philosopher's stone. Are you capable of making a philosopher's stone? Ed exclaimed, his voice full of elation, hope, and surprise. After giving Ed a blank stare, Marco burst out laughing. Yes, I am capable of making those abhorrent stones. Desperately, Marco said. I wish to any divine being that exists that I didn't, but I do. We must be able to create them. It's crucial, Ed said, trembling Marco. The man gave a headshake. I promise you don't want anything to do with those stones, young man. They were made by the devil. No, I need to know. For my brother Sake, I need to know, Ed said, dismissing the man. Marco gave Ed a wide-eyed stare before scowling. You are set in your ways, Marco said, getting to his feet and shaking his head. I apologize, but I am unable to assist you. But I can assure you that the Philosopher's Stone is not the solution. Unable to fully understand what the man was saying, Ed turned to face Marco. With a hint of anger in his voice, Ed said, you know how to make a Philosopher's Stone, the one thing that can pay the price for my brother's body, and you won't reveal the method because you believe we'll be scarred by it. Are you sorry we know how it's made? That we'll be sorry to know? I apologize, Doctor, but the Philosopher's Stone is one of the things I must know regardless of the expense. After shaking his head, Marco approached Naruto and put his hand on his chest. A moment later, red light flooded Naruto's chest, and as the light dimmed, he let out a wheeze before taking a deep breath and jumping up. Naruto inhaled deeply once more and said, it's been a long time since I've been able to breathe normally. With a fresh light in his eyes, Naruto turned to face Marco. What was different about what you did? Naruto asked, glancing down at Marco's clasped hand. Just basic alchemy, Marco retorted, nothing different than what I would have done otherwise. If that's all there is to it, please leave without telling the military where I am. Naruto gave a headshake. Naruto approached Marco slowly and said, no, those injuries were caused by something that only soul energy could cure, not alchemy. Something was augmenting your alchemy. Marco started to back away, obviously frightened and a little irate from the argument he and Ed had just had, but he stopped when soul energy was brought up. What are you saying? With a look of fear on his face, Marco asked. Naruto said, chakra, with a crazed expression in his eyes as he vanished from sight, and then he reappeared behind Marco with a small vial that was a quarter of the way full of blood-red liquid. Naruto inhaled deeply, content with his seemingly restored lungs. and then he looked at the vial intently before letting out a dejected sigh and throwing it to Ed before grabbing the back of Marco's head, guiding him to his table, and slamming the doctor's face onto the wooden surface. "How do you interpret that, Ed?" Naruto asked, appearing ready to go on, but a big hand grabbed his shoulder and dragged him away from Marco. Armstrong said angrily, "I would ask that you not injure my psychiatrist, Naruto, especially with how cordial he's been with you," taking Marco off his table and taking his hand off Naruto's shoulder. Naruto said, "Before you go defending your beloved doctor, let's hear what Ed has to say about that vial over there," as he turned to face Ed, who had uncorked the vial's stopper and dipped his finger into the liquid. Ed's eyes widened as his finger touched the liquid, but the liquid solidified. "Well," Ed started, taking his finger out of the vial and swirling its contents around, then touching the liquid, which caused it to solidify again. "It seems to some kind of highly reactive non-Newtonian fluid." Ed took a stick of chalk out of his pocket and quickly drew a transmutation circle. Then he held the vial in his palm and set it on the circle's edge. Red light surrounded the circle, and Ed grinned before picking up his creation. "It also augments the output of alchemy, increasing it and breaking the fundamental laws of equivalent exchange," Ed said, displaying the largest diamond the group had ever seen. Then Ed grabbed the diamond and threw it as hard as he could at Marco, but Armstrong's hand stopped it in its tracks, setting it down on the table and giving Ed a stern look. "You bastard, all this time you had a philosopher's stone," Ed screamed, his rage growing even more intense. Marco let out a sigh and shook his head. "That stone isn't perfect. In contrast to the mythical philosopher's stone, it will turn to dust if used excessively or too often. That vial was full to the brim when I left the military," Marco said, turning to face Naruto. "What happened to you? According to what you stated, the cause of your injuries was something that only soul energy could heal." After glancing down at Marco, Naruto turned to face the vial Ed was grabbing. "I have a question for you, Marco," Naruto said, choosing not to answer Marco's question. "What is your flawed philosopher's stone made of?" After scowling, Marco leaned back toward the table and buried his face in his hands as grief overcame him. Marco retrieved a second, much smaller vial from his pocket and uncorked it, saying, "During the war, the military high command began intensive research into the possible creation of a philosopher's stone. I have been the head of research into the stone ever since I showed a particular aptitude for thinking outside the box, if you will. After 20 years of research, our results pointed to one thing, one horribly simple thing," he said, spilling the liquid from the vial onto the table. "My trip through the gate only confirmed my research and was the final push I needed to get full military funding," the statement reads. The liquid did not splash, instead, it stayed together and formed a perfect sphere. Ed was staring at the stone in complete astonishment when Marco looked up at him. With tired eyes, Marco picked up the stone and held it out for Ed to hold. The philosopher's stone is supposed to be a perfect substance, a combination of liquid and solid. Even with all of its impurities, there is only one thing that even comes close to being completely perfect. Ed felt the weight of the stone as he reached forward and grasped it. Ed held the stone up next to the stone in the vial and asked, "What is that?" "Human life," Marco said, closely observing Ed. "Every experience, emotion, feeling, want, dream. Everything that makes us human. That incomplete philosopher's stone that you are holding is distilled from the collective souls of over 900 Ishvalan prisoners of war. We then used it to empower our alchemists, inevitably supplying us with more prisoners to fuel the never-ending search for the perfect philosopher's stone." Ed stared at the stone in his hands in horror as he stood there, utterly stunned. He stumbled and then dropped to his knees while continuing to stare at the stone. Ed asked, holding the stone and gazing up at Marco with beseeching eyes, "You're saying that the one thing that my brother and I have been searching for, the one thing that could solve our problems and get El's body back, is made of, and can only be created with human souls?" Marco said, "Correct," and set his vial down on the philosopher's stone in front of him. "There is no other way." Ed lowered his head and gazed at the ground for a long moment. After a few minutes of total quiet, Ed unexpectedly burst out laughing. "It figures that after all of this time searching, when we finally find a means of getting the stone, that something like this would come along and fuck up our plan." Ed then got up and said, "If this is the only way to make a philosopher's stone, then I guess that we just won't use one." He turned to face his brother, who merely gave him a nod of approval. After giving the two brothers a stunned glance, Marco shook his head and put his philosopher's stone in his pocket. He glanced up at Armstrong before turning to face Naruto. "You two are quite the amazing pair, and I wish you luck in your search. I'm truly sorry that you didn't find what you were looking for. How did you figure out that the stones used soul energy, or for that matter how did you receive an injury that you claim could be healed by soul energy?" When Naruto realized his mistake, His eyes grew wide, and he sighed. Naruto said, monotonously, my people specialize in the usage and manipulation of one's soul in order to achieve superhuman feats of strength, agility, and alchemy, as if he had said the same thing 1,000 times before. What do you mean? Marco asked curiously. How can one manipulate their soul? You do so whenever you perform alchemy. Your mind understands the processes going on within the transmutation, however it is your soul that compels the substances involved to bend to your will. My people have developed a way to just use your soul as the required substance. It is like alchemy to your alchemy, similar but fundamentally different. Naruto, who appeared to have prepared this speech well in advance, inhaled deeply. Ed asked incredulously, wait, you use your soul? Doesn't that, kill you? Naruto sighed after turning to face Ed. No, one's soul is an infinitely replenishable source of energy. Although one can exert their souls, simple everyday activities such as eating your favorite food or exercising and time will be all that is needed to refill one's soul. Marco asked, how does one interact with their soul though? If you are able to use your soul in such a way, why haven't we been able to use our souls similarly? As I said, you use your soul as the final component in alchemy in order to manipulate the materials involved. To use your soul like I do, however, you need to spark it at a very young age. Spark it. I've never found a good analogy for this, stated Naruto, putting his hand up to his chin, thinking of what he was going to say next. Imagine that your soul is candle. When you were born, your candle is small and can only provide a very small amount of light for an even smaller amount of time. As you go through your life, you experience new things and your candle grows larger and accumulates more wax, causing it to produce more light and sustain itself for a longer time. After a while, however, your candle stops growing and the wax engulfs the wick, thus preventing your candle from ever being lit. This happens around ages 12 to 14, when you start growing into maturity and have to deal with the hardships of life and the desires of adulthood. However, if one is able to light their wick before it is engulfed by the wax, then they will be able to use their candle as a light and allow it to grow larger, all the while keeping the wax at bay. If one doesn't use their candle for a long time, then the wax will start encroach onto the wick, and if left unabated, will cover your wick and you will never be able to light it again, or at the very least, be incredibly hindered as you try to burr away the accumulated wax. Naruto inhaled deeply once more before glancing at his audience to gauge their response. As he considered whether or not to believe what he had just heard, Marco was lost in thought. Ed, however, was reacting in a more obvious way. You do know how ridiculous that explanation sounds, right? Ed asked, in between chuckles. Our souls are candles. Naruto scowled and then crossed his arms, obviously not liking Ed's response. Do not be so quick to disregard something until it is proven false, said Naruto. Unfortunately, Mr. Uzumaki, I shall have to agree with Ed on this account, Armstrong replied. Your explanation leaves much to be desired. Who are these people you say you come from and why have we never encountered them before? How does your alchemy differ from ours? I believe that a display of your soul-based alchemy is in order, should you wish to convince us fully. And if it is proven that you can manipulate your soul to perform extraordinary feats of alchemy, then I would wish to extend a formal invitation into Amestris' State Alchemist program. Ed and Marco turned to face Armstrong, looking shocked. What? Exclaimed Ed, who was obviously taken aback by Armstrong's assertion. Armstrong looked down at Ed as he turned to face him. Armstrong asked, clearly trying to make a point, what are the 3 rules of the State Alchemist, Ed? Obey the military. Do not create gold. Do not create humans, Ed sighed, scowling but complying. Colonel, what does this have to do with anything? Now define the first rule, obey the military, Armstrong said, raising his hand. Ed said, irritated, to obey the orders of my superiors. That is not completely correct, said Armstrong, to devote oneself to the military hierarchy and to the protection, advancement, and well-being of Amestris, that is what obey the military means in its entirety. If Mr. Uzumaki here can do as he states, then I am obligated by my status as State Alchemist to try to enlist him into our ranks. This is generally the case with most promising alchemists that the military gets wind of. I believe it was Colonel Mustang who was sent to enlist you too. Despite his frustration with the lecture, Ed nodded and finally understood what the colonel was attempting to say. Naruto was still frowning, but for a different reason, so they both turned to face him. Naruto thought to himself, more out of habit than anything else, this is the exact reason why I don't advertise myself. I talk about how my abilities work, and not a second later, the local military is already trying to get their hands on me. But not here, I will show you once we get to Resemble, Naruto said, raising his hand to prevent Quartet from saying anything. Naruto turned to face the frowning Marco. But before Naruto could say anything more, Marco raised his hand. I understand, said Marco, sighing. I was doing the same when you four came in. You don't want some unknown stranger being aware of what you can do, especially if they can somehow recreate what you had worked so hard to accomplish. I don't like it, but I understand. Then Marco's head turned and he saw the eastern amestris twilight skies outside his window. He went over to his table and picked up the chair that had fallen to the ground when Naruto pressed his face against it. Well, now is when I make dinner. So if you are staying then I shall make enough for us all. However, the next train after the 8 o'clock is in the morning, he said while staring at the wall clock next to his doorway. You have about 20 minutes to reach the station before the train leaves. Armstrong gave a headshake. We shall not inconvenience you further, Doctor. I am sorry for the mess we have made and I shall personally come at a later date to pay for any damages we may have caused. Marco chuckled. Alex, please don't take this the wrong way, but I'd prefer if you didn't come back. The less military personnel visiting my house, the better. Armstrong nodded, then bowed slightly to Marco before making his way to the door with Al still on his shoulder and Ed and Naruto following. Oh, and Ed, Marco said, drawing Elric's attention. Yes? Ed asked. I know you two don't want to use the method I have developed to create your Philosopher's Stone, but if you want to, you can take a look at my research notes. Perhaps you can get a sense of where you would like to start from there. Really? Ed exclaimed, his eyes glowing like Christmas lights at the idea. Marco grinned in response to the quartet's response and said, yes, they are located in First Library's cooking section, level 8. Marco's smile had vanished, replaced by a grimace. However, I must warn you, my research was quite detailed. I was a much more ruthless man in my youth, and there are some things there that I am not proud of. Just make sure that, no matter what, if you cannot find another way, you don't use my way. It will weigh on your conscience for the rest of your lives. You are good boys. Don't let desperation ruin that. The doctor watched them with beseeching eyes, and Ed and Al turned to face him. Ed put his left hand to his heart and nodded. I promise, Ed said, glancing up at his brother. Al answered, as do I, lowering his head as much as he could. After giving Marco a final nod, Armstrong turned and walked out the door. Edward, he interrupted, glancing at the wall clock, we must leave soon, or else we may not reach the train in time. Naruto and the elder Elric trailed closely behind, all of them rushing to the Soli train station. Ed was once more observing the passing scenery through the train car window. His brother was standing beside him, discussing with Armstrong the Armstrong family estate and the massive rose bushes that encircled it. Naruto, who appeared to be unaware of his surroundings, was writing in his notebook across from him. The vial of red liquid in his hand was visible when he opened his palm. He now had it until he could find a time to see the doctor again because he had forgotten to give it back to Marco. Naruto said, that must be similar to what God feels like, drawing Ed's attention even though the other two were engrossed in their discussion. Ed nodded, raising the vial to make it easier for him to see in the cabin's overhead light. Hundreds of souls, in the palm of your hand, Naruto went on. This is the culmination of everything that a person is, ended in a single moment, doomed to a fate worse than death. To forever be the source of power for another, to never again being able to taste, touch, hear, see, or smell. To simply exist as a fate I would wish on no one, not even my worst enemies or the most horrible of people. Ed simply kept staring at the vial before setting it down on the cab table. He pulled his piece of chalk from his pocket and quickly drew a transmutation circle on the table's corner. He touched the circle's edge after positioning the vial in its center. Al and Armstrong, who had been remarkably unaware of Ed's schemes until now, were interrupted in their conversation by a flash of bright blue light. When the blue light dimmed, a crystalline dodecahedron containing the remnants of the unfinished Philosopher's Stone appeared in place of a vial. A metal chain was attached to the dodecahedron. Ed grabbed the necklace and raised it. To each of you in there, you will have a body and will live again, Ed said, addressing the stone inside the crystal. Then he stuffed the stone into his shirt after sliding the chain over his head and tucking it under his ponytail. Then he looked up, blushing a little in embarrassment at the show he had just put on for the three people around him. Sorry, said Ed, you two should continue your conversation. Armstrong gave a headshake. No, what you did was a most youthful act, and should be treated as such. Upon arriving in Resemble, I will buy you a copy of the wonderful Make-Out Paradise and we shall revel in the wonder that is literary enlightenment. That smut is not a literary masterpiece, and keep that garbage away from my brother, or I swear, I will rip that little piece of hair out of your head and find the rest of your books and burn them. Naruto laughed as the two kept screaming at each other, with one calling the book a work of the gods, and the other calling it trash. He closed his notebook and gazed out into the pitch black night after taking another deep breath and enjoying the sensation. Naruto thought, I think I may start training again, before he leaned his head against his seat's cushion and dozed off, thinking about philosopher's stones and chakra. After finishing a sparse dinner of whatever he could find in his icebox, Marco sighed and threw his plate into his kitchen sink. I guess I am going to have to go shopping again, he reflected. A knock on his door startled him out of his reverie. Who could that be at this hour? Marco pondered, it can't possibly be Alex again. He reasoned that it wasn't totally out of the question that a town resident had received an urgent call at night. It had occurred several times previously. He approached his door and undid all of its locks. He opened the door and staggered back, his face plastered with horror. There was a woman unlike any other standing in the doorway. The woman flicked back her waist length black hair and crossed the threshold, cooing, "Ah, is that how you greet an old acquaintance?" With her unfathomable grace and beauty, the woman was the epitome of femininity. Her eyes, a crimson that only the best wines can have, glared down at Marco with ruthless contempt. Any man would be filled with longing as she radiated an aura of unadulterated animal desire. Her attire only served to highlight that fact. Her favorite outfit was a one-piece, calf length, strapless dress, and she wore long black gloves that reached her shoulders. The woman proudly displayed an Ouroboros tattoo on the middle of her chest, just below the collarbone. Fearfully, Marco asked, his hand slowly going to his pocket, "How did you find me?" After chuckling, the woman raised her hand and gestured to Marco with her index finger. The appendage quickly grew longer, and before Marco realized what was happening, the woman's finger was piercing his hand. When Marco screamed in agony and tried to remove the finger from his skin, he discovered that it was riveted there and that it was far stronger than any steel. With her high heels clacking on the house's wood, the woman stepped forward. Her angle changed with each step, and the outstretched finger shortened as she moved forward, aligning itself so that it was twisting the skin in Marco's hand. She knelt before the physician, twisting her finger one last time before yanking it from Marco's grasp. With a tone full of condescension, the woman questioned, "Did you really think you could hide forever?" "Aye," was all Marco could say, unable to respond due to the combination of pain and terror. The woman leaned forward and put her mouth to Marco's ear. It was only a matter of time before word spread of a miracle doctor who could cure anyone of their ills, she said. "You slipped up, Marco." The house was filled with the sound of a wet thump. The woman's body slid down a cone of wood that rose from the floor, and Marco watched in abstract horror. But instead of blood, red lightning poured from the wound, and before Marco could scream, the woman's hand slashed out and struck his face, sending him flying into his home's wall. The woman cutting herself from the wood spike and another woman entering his home with a big black bag were the last things he saw before he passed out. Enjoying the sensation of being able to breathe correctly, Naruto inhaled deeply once more in the clean mountain air. He pivoted, surveying the vast stretches of meadows and fields that encircled Rizembul. Situated near the region that was formerly known as Ishval, deep within the mountain range of eastern Amestris, was a small agricultural town called Rizembul. Although the city was not well known, it was the unofficial center of the nearby villages and a well-liked stopover for commuters traveling between South City and East City. It had served as a staging area for numerous incursions into Ishvalan territory during the Ishvalan War, but it had since been abandoned and was left in a state of relative tranquility. The group had been walking along a dirt path for the past 30 minutes, and it seemed that this path led to Ed's auto mail mechanic, whose home was a little further up the mountain. Low stone walls on either side of the path appeared to be fairly old and did little to prevent the rangy bovine from crossing the dirt path. Naruto gazed up at Ed, who had remained silent during their stroll and instead gave specific items or locations a distant glance. On their way out of town, Ed had even taken a moment to look at an apple orchard they had passed. Ed muttered, more to himself than to anyone else, "We should be almost there." The group saw a large two-story house as soon as they reached the top of the small hill they had been trudging up. The house had bright walls and green beams that contrasted with its inviting yellow color. There was a big painted sign in front of the house that said, "Automail here," in big white letters, and 3 chimneys on top of the house were smoking from use. A red banner hung from the railing of a balcony on the second floor of the house, above the main entrance. But time had eroded whatever words might have been inscribed on it beyond recognition. An elderly woman was smoking her pipe while seated in a rocking chair on the front porch. As soon as she saw the group ascending the hill, the woman hurried out of her seat and went inside. The woman reappeared as the group got closer to the house, but this time she didn't have her pipe. She went down the stairs of the house and stopped in front of the group. Ed moved forward to be addressed first. The woman appeared to be in her late 70s, but it was impossible to tell for sure. She was about 4.5 feet tall, making her even shorter than Ed in this particular situation. She was half a foot taller because her gray hair was tucked into an odd top knot that protruded straight from the top of her head. Her eyes were hidden by a pair of round, wire-framed glasses that reflected sunlight. With a sly smile, the woman took her hands from her white apron and folded them before her. The elderly woman asked, glancing at the group behind Ed, "Well, if it isn't young Ed, what have you done and gotten yourself into this time?" With a sheepish laugh, Ed put his hand behind his head. In an embarrassed tone, Ed said, "Yeah, Al and I have kinda fallen apart. Do you think you could fix us up?" After nodding, the elderly woman said, "Sure, Ed. Winry and I are always here to help." She then turned to face Al, who was still being carried by Armstrong, and asked, "How's it going, Al?" Though his response was ambiguous, Al still sounded pleased. "Well, not as great as I'd hoped, but better than it could be," he said. Ed moved aside to introduce his companions, as if he remembered he had company. "Granny," said Ed, "this is Major Alex Lewis Armstrong." After setting Al's box on the ground beside him, the enormous man reached down and took the elderly woman's hand. The woman said, "Pleasure, I am Pinako Rockbell." Then Ed extended his hand in Naruto's direction. "And this is Naruto Uzumaki." The woman shook the taller man's hand once more, then took a step back to assess the entire group. Pinako grinned at Ed's expression as the compliment he had anticipated was reversed. "Well, it's been a while, Ed, and to me, it seems as though you've gone and grown smaller." "You're doing it wrong, Granny," Ed said. "You're supposed to say me, how big you've grown." His expression was the height of frustration. Still smirking at how easily Ed was agitated, Pinako asked, "Why would I say something so blatantly untrue? I'm still taller than you, you old ha." Ed would have continued, but a tiny wrench striking his face cut off his speech. "Ed, I told you to call ahead if you needed maintenance," a young woman called from the house's second-story balcony. The woman was beautiful, with a beauty reserved for young people. Despite being a good few inches taller than Ed, she must have been around the same age. An olive-colored bandana kept her long, blonde hair out of her face until it reached the middle of her back. But two bangs appeared to have slipped out from under the bandana and were now dangling loosely on either side of her face. The top part of the gray jumpsuit she was wearing hung loosely around her waist. The only thing shielding her modesty was a tube top, which appeared to be more for practicality than style. Her bright blue eyes, which displayed an intense curiosity rarely seen in someone so young, were her most striking feature. Ed stood up and rubbed the quickly developing bruise on his forehead, exclaiming, "What the hell, Winry, are you trying to kill me?" After chuckling, the young woman leaned back from the balcony railing and said, "It's good to see you back, Ed." As Winry opened the box that Ed had brought from East City, Naruto laughed. His mail arm, or what was left of it, was inside. A variety of cables and wires slipped through the woman's fingers like sand as she reached into the box. Ed said, "Yeah, I know, it's a little smashed up," from his spot on the couch in the living room. His brother sat beside him, but Alphonse was still in pieces and needed help to move at all. Winry turned and gazed sorrowfully at Ed. Winry said, "A little smashed up? It's in pieces. Do you know how long I slaved over this? It was my best creation." "It's the same thing," Ed said, sipping the tea that Pinako had given him. As Winry hurled one of the bigger pieces of the arm at Ed's head, Ed quickly turned his head to the side and said, "It's just in smaller pieces." Winry rubbed the bridge of her nose, sighed, and put the box lid back on. She turned and leaned back against the kitchen table, where Armstrong and Pinako were sitting at the moment, amusedly watching the spectacle. In contrast, Naruto was observing from a slightly farther distance while leaning against the wall close to the living room door. The embodied armor chuckled uneasily as Winry said, "And you're all smashed up as well. I swear, you two only exist to worry me," she said to Al. "So," Pinako said as she took out her tiny pipe, "what happened?" Ed sighed after settling into a comfortable position on the couch. Ed put his hand on his chin and asked, "Where to begin?" "Well, I guess you guys have heard of the serial killer who is targeting alchemists, right?" he said. Pinako took out her tobacco tin, filled her pipe, lit it, and nodded as Winry's face became noticeably paler. Pinako responded, "Yeah, we've heard about him," lighting the leaves on her pipe and saying, "He killed some general recently, or something like that." Ed gave a nod of agreement. "Yeah," Ed said reluctantly. "Well, we fought him, but were incredibly outclassed in the matter." With a gasp, Winry raised her hands to her mouth. Ed rubbed his arm stump before turning to face Naruto with a guilty expression. It goes without saying that after that, We were hard-pressed to do anything other than run. He cornered us, and in our attempt to escape, Al lost most of his body and I lost my arm. Naruto saved Al and me from Scar, and if it wasn't for him, we would surely be dead. He lost his arm in our defense, which is why I also needed to ask a favor of Winry and you. After glancing at Naruto, Panako nodded her aging head. Panako responded, done, before Ed had a chance to express the request. Ed said, thanks, with genuine appreciation in his voice. Even though he pretended otherwise, he was aware of the amount of work required to create auto mail, particularly for something as intricate as an arm. Panako took another drag from her pipe and was asked to continue your story. Ed remarked, well, there is not much more to tell. On the way up here, we met an old acquaintance of Major Armstrong, who gave us a very promising lead on the Philosopher's Stone. On that note, how long do you think it will take to make the auto mail? Without replying right away, Panako took another long drag from her pipe, then tipped it over and emptied its contents into an ashtray on the kitchen table. Panako got up from her chair and approached Ed. So, you need to get this done as quickly as possible so you can procure this lead, am I right? She asked. Ed said, yay, it's kind of a rushed order, sorry, and took another sip of his tea. Bending over, Panako raised his auto mail leg and compared it to his own. Panako said, it's not just your arm, your leg will also need adjustments, as she measured the distance between Ed's auto mail foot and the real one. After helping to commit the image to memory, she approached Naruto and raised her gaze to him. Panako reached into her apron and took out a measuring tape. Young man, I will have to ask you to remove your coat and sit down, she said. After removing his cloak, Naruto showed off his red dress shirt, which still had the sleeve torn off from his encounter with Scar. Panako took measurements of his other arm and shoulders as he sat down. Ed asked again, so, how long do you think it will take? You know, Ed, Panako said, taking a measurement of Naruto's chest width. Patience is a valuable trait to have. Ed complained angrily, but he held off until Panako had completed measuring Naruto. After a few minutes, Panako moved away from Naruto, removing her pipe and placing her hand on her chin. Panako said, well, leg aside, with the state your arm's in, we're gonna have to start from scratch, not to mention Naruto's arm, as he picked up the box containing Ed's arm remnants from the kitchen table. Ed asked in a somewhat optimistic tone, do you think you could complete it in 2 weeks? Panako gave a very unladylike snort. 7 days, that's what we'll need, Panako said, turning around with the box in her hands and a defiant expression on her face. Please, Ed, give us some credit, she said. Then she looked over at Winry. Winry nodded and went to her workshop upstairs, saying, Winry, darling, could you go and fetch the spare for Ed? Panako turned to face Naruto and Armstrong. Sorry boys, but we've only got 2 spare beds, so one of you is gonna have to take the sofa. Naruto leaned off the wall and said, I shall take the sofa. Armstrong protested, Mr. Naruto, I must protest, because he did not like the idea of removing the injured person's bed. After chuckling, Naruto shook his head. Naruto approached Ed and Al and sat between them, seemingly claiming the couch, saying, sorry Major, but if you slept on the couch, I'm afraid they would need to buy new furniture by the time we leave. Armstrong acknowledged Naruto's point about his unusually large size with an indignant huff, but he made no further protests. Winry reappeared in the room a moment later, this time with a standard prosthetic leg. She approached Ed, knelt down, and removed the hydraulic restraints that had held Ed's auto mail leg securely fastened to his thigh. Well, I guess this proves that your growth isn't completely stunted, Winry said with a smile as she unscrewed his final release valve. Ed said, oh shut up WINR, as Winry pulled his auto mail leg out of its socket. Ed's leg's nerve endings were violently severed, causing him to hiss in agony. God, I hate that feeling. Using a few screws rather than the hydraulics his auto mail relied on, Winry silently snapped the standard prosthetic into position. Unaccustomed to the sensation of a non-responsive leg, Ed got to his feet but staggered forward a bit. Well? Panako asked. Ed leaned side to side to get a feel for the prosthetic and responded, it's weird, not being on my normal leg, but I'll get used to it. Well, don't get too comfortable, Panako ordered as he took Winry's leg back. We'll have your leg ready and back to you before you know it. In the meantime, I suggest helping around the house, maybe giving your friends a tour around the town and showing them the orchard. Sure thing Granny, and once again, thanks, Ed said as he continued to move around. Then, with a more assured gait, he made his way to the kitchen door. With a, don't thank us just yet, Winry answered. We charge extra for rush orders and that's on top of the small fortune you're already spending for a leg adjustment and 2 arms. Ed said dismissively, Yeah, and left the kitchen. Ed said, "Come on guys, let me show you round the town," to Naruto and Armstrong in particular. Al asked in a somewhat dejected tone that he was unable to accompany his brother on the tour. "Do you think you could get me a book while you're out?" However, he was aware that, despite Armstrong's claims of strength, it was no easy task to carry a 300-pound suit of armor up a hill for 30 minutes, and Armstrong was likely exhausted from the experience. "Sure thing, Al," Ed answered. He would go to the small bookstore in town and get Al any cookbooks and fantasy books he could find. Al's personal hobby since losing his taste buds was to record any food he saw that seemed especially delicious so that he could taste them all when he regained his body. Ed grinned at his brother's belief that they would discover a way to heal his body. The fact that Al approached it as a when, rather than a if, only made Ed more determined to figure out how to retrieve his brother's body. He had to because Ed would not allow Al to bear the consequences of his own errors, never again. With mild fascination, Naruto observed Armstrong assiduously converting all of Pinako's extra logs into firewood. The reason that this normally mundane act was made fascinating was that instead of using the conventional method of an axe and hammer, Armstrong was using his bare fists to do the cutting. Or smashing in this instance. Alphonse was sitting next to him, reading a cookbook about curries from Zingi's. Naruto had discovered a lot about his new friends in the 3 days since the group had arrived at the Rockbell home. The Rockbells were a long-standing family in this community, seemingly serving as one of the town's patron families since its inception. The Rockbells used to own the orchard down the road, but with Winry's parents pursuing a more academic profession, they deigned to sell the orchard. They added 8 more rooms and a second story to Pinako's house using the funds they had received. They sold the orchard to Trisha Elric and Van Hohenheim, who just so happened to be Ed and Al's parents. They then sold the railroad company the majority of the orchard for a high price. Despite the fact that the majority of her family's orchard had been uprooted, Pinako evidently knew Trisha and Hohenheim well, so no animosity was harbored against them. Naruto leaned over to see what Al was studying in the cookbook at the moment. "Find anything good, Alphonse?" Naruto asked, attempting to decipher the dish's name. "Yay, it's a Zingi's pumpkin curry with a thing called squid. It sounded interesting and I was considering adding it to my list," Al said, making the choice appear to be challenging given how full his notebook was already. Naruto responded, That sounds tasty. Squid is one of my personal favorites," as he leaned back against the barrel that he and Al were supporting themselves with. "Where do you get squid?" "I've never heard of it," asked Al, genuinely curious. Naruto said, "I'm not surprised, since squid can only be fished in the ocean," in a sobering tone. Al exclaimed, "You've been to the sea?" With a start. Amestris was a landlocked nation, with Erugo to the south providing the closest access to the ocean. They were currently at war with Erugo, a nation they had been at war with for the previous 200 years. It goes without saying that very few Amestrians ever saw the ocean. I have," Naruto said, grinning at the young person's inquisitive enthusiasm. Al asked, putting down his book and listening intently to Naruto, "What's it like?" Naruto put his hands behind his head and gazed into space. "Well, I would start by saying it's indescribable, but that isn't a satisfactory answer. The ocean is, well, it is the largest thing I have ever seen in my life," he said. "That must be pretty big," Al implied in a surprised tone. Naruto glanced at Al and then burst out laughing. "You have no idea. When you look at the sea, you just see blue for all the way to the horizon and the sky reflects off the water and you just think you are walking among the clouds. The air is moist and salty and smells wonderful. You and your brother have never experienced anything else, but the air here in Amestris is pretty dry." Naruto seemed to lose himself in his description, thinking of all the things he associated with the sea, good and bad. "The ocean sounds beautiful," said Al, captivated by Naruto's explanation. "It is. I will never tire of seeing the ocean. It is one constant that will always be there, no matter how old you live to be," Naruto said, still engrossed in his descriptive fantasy. Naruto looked back at Al. "Hey Al, yes?" Naruto looked up into Al's crimson eyes and said, "Promise me, if you ever get the chance to see the ocean, take it. Nobody should have to go through their life and not see it at least once." A little taken aback by the seriousness of the question, Al answered, "S. Sure, so long as my brother can come along." After giving Al a brief glance, Naruto grinned and nodded. Naruto said, "Good," leaning back and closing his eyes. "I'm going to take a short nap. Please wake me up when dinner time arrives." "Sure thing, Mr. Naruto," Al said. Thinking that the moment was over, he turned around and opened his book, but he was unable to focus and closed it again. Gazing up at the clear blue sky, Al saw a vast expanse of it. "I wonder," Al pondered, "is that how the ocean appears?" Ed was sitting in front of a small headstone in Resemble's small cemetery, which said, Trisha Elric, beloved mother and wife, 1878.1904. Ed had purchased a bouquet of white flowers in town to place on top of the headstone. You know, Mom, Al came up to me yesterday and told me he wanted to see the ocean, just out of the blue. But only when he is human does he express a desire to feel the ocean as well as see it. The ease with which Al recovers after learning about the Philosopher's Stone astounds me. Since I don't believe anyone else we know could have been there, I believe Naruto must have played a role in Al's wish to see the sea. Ed, who was playing with some grass to kill time while he spoke with his mother, laughed half-heartedly at his own joke. He and Naruto have gotten pretty close, and I think Al views him as one of his best friends. That is unless Granny is a surprise explorer that we don't know about. Although that's good, Al needs more friends who aren't in the military. Ed glanced up at the sky, taking in the hue shifts as the sun began its gradual transition into night. I will have to leave. Granny will be very upset if I arrive late because she is preparing stew tonight. I'll see you again tomorrow, Ed said as he slowly got to his feet and put his hand on the headstone for a brief moment, seemingly attempting to feel his mother through the chilly gray stone. He then lifted his hand from the stone and gazed down at it before turning around and leaving the cemetery, eventually making his way to the Rockbell residence. After observing Pinako carefully twisting each screw into his soon-be auto mail arm, Naruto noticed that it was almost 3 in the morning. The Rockbells had been operating in this manner for the past 5 days, with only one day off between the creation of Ed's arm and Naruto's. Since Pinako had started working mostly on the kitchen table and Winry was no longer in the shop, Naruto had a first-hand look at the process of creating auto mail. Pinako put down her screwdriver, pulled out her pipe, and filled it with tobacco, then turned to face Naruto, who had been silently watching for the past 6 hours since dinner was over and everyone had gone to bed, or, in Winry's case, upstairs to work on Naruto's auto mail, a routine that had been going on for the past 5 days. Other than the occasional question from Naruto regarding the auto mail, they hadn't really spoken. You are one of the most patient people I have ever met, Pinako said as she lit her pipe and took a long drag. Naruto grinned. Naruto moved slightly on the wall and said, thanks, adding, but as you mentioned, patience is a quality that is highly valued. Pinako laughed and snorted. She took another drag. I said that just to get Ed to shut up, she said. Even so, there is truth in those words, Naruto answered. Pinako sat for a moment, feeling the slight rush of nicotine in her head, and nodded in agreement. Pinako started, so, how did you, Ed, and Al meet? Naruto gave Pinako a perplexed look. Ed and Al told you, didn't they? With a tone of surprise, Naruto asked. Yes, but that's only their side of the story. Pinako smiled at their account of the encounter, saying, they said you showed up out of nowhere when they were in some backwater city called Lior and have been following them ever since. Hey, that is actually not too far from the truth, Naruto laughed and said, Lior is a very religious city, to put it mildly. Alchemy and religion don't typically go hand in hand, but they didn't see much danger at the time. They were obviously flaunting their status as state alchemists. Pinako said, that's Ed, showy as ever, as she stood up and went to the kitchen to prepare a kettle for tea. Please continue. When Naruto learned that he had essentially stalked the Elrics for a brief period of time, Pinako tensed up a little. Anyway, I shadowed them for a while, finding out why a state alchemist would be in Lior, a city that has relatively no value to the military whatsoever. It turned out that they were pursuing the local religious leader, a man named Cornello. In order to convince the people of Lior that he was the prophet of their divine god Leto, he had been using a pseudo-philosopher's stone. I then introduced myself, got them out of a tight spot, and have been with them ever since. Cornello was exposed as a fraud by Ed and Al, who caught him red-handed. However, the stone was useless. After the story was over, Pinako took one last drag before emptying her pipe's contents into her ashtray after listening to it with rapt attention. Naruto, thank you. The boys don't communicate with us very often. Pinako chuckled. 3 years is a long time. The last letter we got from them stated that Ed was a state alchemist and that he wouldn't be around for a while. Hearing that they are doing well is encouraging. Pinako heard the low bubbling that indicated the water was boiling and turned to face the teapot. She got up and went to the kitchen, where she took the kettle off the stove and poured its contents into a small teapot, which she then carried to the table with 2 mugs. They are doing well, Naruto said as he accepted Pinako's cup of tea, but their success has not come without fault. How? Pinako asked. Ed can be stubborn and even downright disobedient at times. Naruto took a sip of his tea and retorted, and, given his status as a state alchemist, he has knocked heads with more than a few military higher-ups. He also has a knack for finding trouble in even the most mundane situations. After chuckling and taking a sip of her tea, Pinako returned her attention to the auto, mail arm and continued working. Putting down her screwdriver, Pinako said, "That sounds like Ed," while displaying a portion of what would soon be Naruto's elbow. Naruto said, "Despite that, they've also made quite a few friends as well," as he moved to sit on the couch. Pinako put down her elbow and picked up her screwdriver. "That's good," she said. "Friends are a valuable thing, one that most of us take for granted," she said. Naruto leaned back on the couch and said, "That they are. Pinako, may I ask a personal question?" "Depends," Pinako answered. "Whatever became of their dad? They haven't even mentioned their father, and I am aware that Trisha perished in the plagues." With a sigh, Pinako put down her screwdriver and took a sip of her tea. "I used to drink with the boy's father, Van Hohenheim. He and I have a long history together, and I was the one who first introduced him to Trisha. Being newlywed and all, I only allowed my son to sell them that orchard because I knew it would benefit them. I don't even know whether he is alive or not," Pinako sighed, "but one day, about a year before the Ishvalan War began, he simply up and left the village, leaving his wife and sons behind." How did Winry's parents fare? A little irate over the whole abandonment problem, Naruto asked. "I haven't seen them about." "Gone," Pinako sadly retorted. "They both died in the war." Naruto said, "I'm sorry for your loss," not liking that he had brought up such a delicate topic. "It's okay. I long ago came to terms with their deaths. You see, they were surgeons. They went to see what they could do because there were never enough doctors to treat the injured." Pinako sighed before picking up the arm and getting back to work. "The war was a terrible, stupid thing," Naruto said somberly. Pinako concurred, yes it was." After a while, the first light of day peeked through the kitchen window, and Pinako turned to the wall clock to see the time, which was 5:30. The conversation stopped there, neither of them saying anything, and silence returned, the only sound being Pinako's screwdriver clicking against the mail. Pinako remarked, "I better get breakfast started," more to herself than to Naruto, who heard her anyway. Naruto said, "I can go get the wood," bending down and touching his toes while leaning off the wall and extending forward slightly. "Oh, and Naruto," Pinako said, rising from her chair and heading into the kitchen with the teapot and cups. "That would be lovely," she said. At the front door, Naruto paused and turned to see Pinako smile kindly at him. "Thanks for the company," Naruto nodded, grinning. Naruto said, "Anytime," and then stepped outside into the crisp morning air. Since Pinako and Winry were currently upstairs in the second-story workshop, they had some privacy. Naruto was seated on one side of the kitchen table, while Armstrong, Ed, and Al were seated on the other of the table. Naruto leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and said, "So, I think you guys have some questions for me." "Yes, I believe we all do," responded Armstrong. "If you don't mind boys, I would like to ask a few of my questions first." "Sure," Ed said, reclining in his seat. "I don't mind," Al added. "All right, let's start. You said that your people manipulate souls in Marco's home. What is the origin of your people, and why has Amestris never encountered them?" The question was reasonable, and Naruto nodded. "The land I come from is known as Konohagakure and is located on the far side of Shing, way to the east," said Naruto. "Scouts have been dispatched as far east as the Great Ocean. Why didn't they come across your people back then?" Armstrong asked. The response from Naruto, "I guess your scouts passed through a large forest on their way," was clearly a prelude to something. Armstrong replied, "Unfortunately, I have not looked at the maps directly, so I wouldn't know," with a shrug of his substantial shoulders. "Konohagakure is situated far into the woods," Naruto said, "so I'm not surprised your people didn't find us. Why didn't you speak to our government when you arrived if you were from a foreign country that we haven't previously contacted? Wouldn't you at least attempt to establish communication between your people and Amestris if you've been here as long as you appear to have been?" Armstrong was being extremely thorough, so Naruto grinned. "My people have strong xenophobic sentiments. We keep a close eye on our territory and don't even trade with Shing. My opinions about other nations are highly discouraged in Konohagakure, which is one of the primary reasons I left," Naruto replied in a fluid and unhesitating manner. "You say you have the ability to control your soul. How did your people come to know this?" Armstrong folded his arms, listening intently to everything Naruto had said so far. "Well, We don't know how he did it, but the first person to learn of chakra manipulation. What? Then Ed interrupted Naruto. Chakra, it is basically our word for soul, Naruto said, receiving an understanding nod from Ed. Anyway, the first person in our culture that learned chakra manipulation was the Sage of Six Paths, who taught us the secrets of our soul. Brother, said Al. Ed completed his brother's thought by saying, yeah, I know Al, that sounds an awful lot like the philosophers of the East and West. So, are there any more questions you guys have? Referring to Ed and Al, Naruto posed the query. Ed said, yeah, but what precisely is your chakra capable of? You can manipulate your soul, which sounds really cool. But what's the point if it doesn't actually accomplish anything? Good question, Ed, replied Naruto. Given enough time, work, and ingenuity, a person who has access to their chakra can accomplish practically anything, and this is not an exaggeration when I say anything. So what, are you able to breathe fire or something? Ed asked casually. Yes, actually, Naruto said, smiling at their response. As if he had just grown a second head, Ed, Al, and even Armstrong were staring at Naruto. Bullshit, Ed answered. After chuckling, Naruto rose from his seat. Ed, Al, and Armstrong trailed closely behind, still doubting the veracity of Naruto's claim, as he said, come on, I'll show you guys something cool, and made his way to the house's back door. Since the entire mountain was their backyard, the Rockbell house didn't really have a backyard. Naruto left the house through the back door and continued climbing the mountain until the Rockbell house was completely hidden from view. He stopped when he came to a good-sized cutout of the mountains with a low slope that was covered in flowers and grass, and there was a big tree close to the steeper portion of the cutout where the mountain resumed its steep incline. Ed plopped down on the ground and rubbed his prosthetic thigh, threatening, Naruto, I swear, if you brought us hiking all the way up here for nothing, I'm gonna kick your ass, one arm or no. Armstrong, who had also had to carry Al all the way up, was in a similar frame of mind, though he didn't express it. Ed gave Naruto a frustrated look before Naruto raised his hand in peace. You guys knew what you were getting the moment you started that hike, Naruto said, amused. Naruto turned and bowed after walking a short distance ahead of the three. Gentlemen and gentler men, I present to you Gokakyu no Jutsu, Naruto said abruptly as his left hand made a number of strange motions before coming to a stop. His hand was held in place just below his mouth, with his middle and index fingers pointing straight up, their tips actually touching his lips, and his pinky and ring fingers tucked. Naruto took a deep breath, held it for a moment, and then yelled. Kaden. Jutsu no Gokakyu. The grass where the fireball had passed over was completely blackened, just demonstrating how hot the fire was. Naruto turned around, breathing heavily and pressing his hand against his chest. He smiled at what he saw and laughed despite his haggard breathing. Fire release. Great fireball technique, he exhaled, but instead of exhaling, he released a massive ball of fire about 10 feet across, which launched about 30 feet in front of him before finally dispersing. Al clapped his arm against his breastplate, Ed looked stunned, and Armstrong frowned. That is one of our lower class techniques, although generally it would be a lot bigger, but due to certain circumstances most of my chakra abilities are somewhat restrained and do not have as large an effect as they should, said Naruto. You just inhaled fucking flames. Still staring at the burned ground where Naruto's fireball had passed over, Ed yelled. Look at Mustang, he can create firestorms at the touch of a finger, Naruto said sheepishly, but it's not that impressive. In denial, Ed shook his head. No, you're not understanding. It ignites the air or something, like a Mustang. You just started a fire. That shouldn't be feasible based on the law of conservation of mass. Ed shook his head, attempting to think of a rational response. You are not supposed to be able to just create matter, he said. Naruto gave a shrug. I've never truly found an answer in my entire life, and, as I've said before, the soul is an ever-replenishing resource, Naruto casually retorted. And after so long I just decided to go with it. It only requires physical or emotional stimulation to grow. Ed started by saying, that is another thing I meant to ask you, how can our souls grow? We all have a single soul, after all. As if one is equal to one. The one always equals one, regardless of how large it is written. Naruto gave a headshake. The soul you're thinking of is personality, not the actual soul, Naruto clarified. Your and my ideas of souls are different. The soul is one of two halves that represent a useful resource for which I can apply my techniques, at least when it comes to chakra. What's the other half? Al asked. Naruto gave Al a quick glance before using his hand to brush his hair back. Naruto sat down with his legs crossed and said, boy, this brings me back to my days in the academy. Alright, so chakra consists of two parts, physical and spiritual. Although the majority of people are born with roughly the same amount of chakra, everyone has chakra to varied degrees. Chakra follows the same pathways as your circulatory system as it moves through your body. Let me introduce you to the chakra network. Are you on board? Armstrong, Al, and Ed all nodded. All right, so your chakra pool expands as you live longer. A person with a larger chakra pool than someone who has done nothing will undoubtedly be the one who has accomplished the most in life, such as reading the most books or exercising the most. Armstrong has a far larger pool of physical chakra because he has worked out for the majority of his life, pushing his body to its limits. However, Marco has a much larger pool of spiritual chakra than Armstrong because he has dedicated his entire life to studying. Al raised his hand to inquire, but Naruto halted when he said, "Yes, Al. If someone has too much of either, their chakra techniques will be biased toward that form of chakra." Does the user's age affect the chakra? For example, what if an elderly man has read and worked out for the majority of his life, but as he ages, his body and mind become less strong or sharper than they once were? That is a very clever question, Al, Naruto said. To answer your question, no, an 80-year-old man would still be able to use the chakra that he possessed. However, the stress of the methods might be too much for his body or mind to handle. You mentioned that there are methods that correspond with your chakra's state. What are those methods? Armstrong asked, still frowning but very interested. There are 3 different approaches to technique in my culture. They are referred to as jutsu, which roughly means technique. Although the most common practice is specialization, a person who has balanced their studies and physical training would be able to use techniques from all 3. Genjutsu, taijutsu, and ninjutsu are the names of the 3 disciplines. Ninjutsu would include the fireball I made earlier. People who don't have a strong physical or mental bias in their training frequently pursue ninjutsu because it's a very neutral path. I am an expert in ninjutsu myself. The path that focuses mostly on physical combat, such as using chakra to enhance one's movements to superhuman levels and traditional martial arts, is known as taijutsu, or body technique. Armstrong said, so in East City, when you disappeared, as his eyes widened in understanding of Naruto's up until that point enigmatic disappearance. Yes, I used chakra so that I could find Ed and Al quicker, Naruto answered. What is the last route? Ed, who was as intrigued as Armstrong, inquired. Of the 3 routes to follow, Genjutsu, or illusory techniques, is arguably the most terrifying and challenging. The goal of Genjutsu is to confuse an opponent's senses, causing them to perceive things differently than they actually do. Hypnosis is probably the closest thing to Genjutsu, albeit much more sophisticated and potent. After completing his explanation and observing his friend's response, Naruto inhaled deeply. Hold on. Are you implying that you have power over others? Ed asked, casting a nervous glance at Naruto. Well, not me per.se, but there have been a few people in our history who have been able to, more or less, control the target, said Naruto, placing his hand on his head. For the most part, however, Genjutsu is used more as a distraction than anything else. A diversion? What do you mean? Armstrong asked, not particularly fond of the notion that there is a race of people who have the ability to manipulate others at will. After letting out a sigh, Naruto made more hand-flipping motions, just like he had done when he made the Gokaku no Jutsu. Get ready, Naruto said, closing his eyes and appearing to focus. Kokwangyo no Jutsu, or bringer of darkness technique, caused the world to darken until Armstrong and Ed could see nothing but their own bodies. It was as though they were in a world of darkness where the only light came from their bodies. What on earth went wrong? Nothing is visible to me, Ed exclaimed as he leapt to his feet and surveyed the clearing, which appeared to him to be nothing more than a vast black space. Armstrong was considerably more composed in this circumstance, surveying his black world before raising his hand while maintaining perfect clarity. Armstrong said, most unusual, so this is Genjutsu. Then, as soon as the darkness arrived, it vanished, leaving one suit of armor that was more confused than anything and 2 terrified alchemists. Why didn't I get impacted? Al asked, glancing at Ed and Armstrong and noting their trembling states. Wiping the perspiration from his brow due to the high level of focus the technique demanded, Naruto shrugged. I'm not sure. Maybe it's because I can't influence your senses. In an attempt to lighten the somewhat tense situation, Naruto responded, but then again, I'm no Genjutsu expert, so don't take my word for it. By all rights, you shouldn't even be able to see, speak, or hear, yet here you are. A direct contradiction to science, he said. Armstrong said, rising to his feet and moving around, I can definitely see possible combat applications of that technique alone, and you say there is more? That was a most terrifying experience. To the 3 alchemists' dismay, Naruto responded, thousands more, but don't worry, the majority of them aren't as powerful as that one. Actually, only my former master and one of the most influential practitioners in our history, Hashirama Senju, was able to use it. So, how can you use it? Still a little stunned by the encounter, Ed asked, you mentioned that you were an expert in ninjutsu, correct? That is accurate. Although skill is a significant component of that technique, it is not the only limitation. It consumes a great deal of chakra, much more than the typical genjutsu practitioner would typically possess, Naruto said solemnly. Fortunately, I have chakra in spades. After a while, Naruto stood up, brushed off his jacket, and approached the group of 3 alchemists who had nodded before withdrawing into their own thoughts. So, do you have any more queries? Naruto asked, glancing down at the 3. Just one, Armstrong said, getting to his feet. Will enlist in the Amestrian military? After giving Armstrong a brief glance, Naruto burst out laughing. Naruto said, I almost forgot that you gave me that offer, with a shake of his head. Sorry, but I'll have to refuse, he said. Armstrong sighed and got to his feet, looking very powerful. Armstrong put his hands behind his back and responded, then when I get back to Central, I'll have to put you under arrest and take you to the Führer for more interrogation and analysis. Ed and Al stared at Armstrong, completely taken aback by the Major's response. Major? What on earth? Ed said as he approached the bigger man. Armstrong continued to frown as he turned to face Ed. This man just demonstrated skills far beyond our capabilities, Ed. Furthermore, he asserts that he has access to thousands more. This would not be an issue and would even be encouraged if he were an ally of Amestris. According to the facts, he isn't. He is a serious danger to Amestris, her people, and her Führer, Armstrong said, turning back to Naruto. Now that you've heard my justification and the repercussions, won't you change your mind? With a frustrated sigh, Naruto gazed up at the heavens. Naruto turned around and headed for the tree on the edge of the cutout, which had been partially burned by Naruto's Gokaku no Jutsu. I need to think, he said. Naruto was left alone with his thoughts as Armstrong, Ed, and Al turned to face him before heading down to the Rockbell house. With a sigh, Naruto gazed up at the full moon that hung over his head, so bright that the field he had been sitting in was illuminated with perfect clarity. The only indication to an observer that it was night was the silvery tint the moonlight cast on the landscape. A stick snap caused Naruto to turn away from the moon, and he saw Armstrong's hulking form climbing the steep hill. After a few moments, he stood up, put his conical hat on his head, and turned to wait for him, who had just reached the last crest of the hill. When Armstrong saw Naruto, he stopped because the shorter man had a sinister appearance due to his black coat, high collar, and concealing hat. Armstrong said, "You're still here," with a hint of surprise in his voice. Naruto gave a nod. Naruto slipped his hand into his pocket and said, "I assume you thought I was going to leave," in response. "I had hoped you would," Armstrong said. "Why is that?" Naruto asked. "I respect you very much and I do not wish to harm the Elric's savior," Armstrong said, "despite my accusations. Have you considered my offer?" "I have," Naruto said, "and?" Armstrong asked. "I refuse to associate with any military force. I fight only for myself and those I think deserve to be protected," Naruto said, much to Armstrong's dismay. "That is what I thought," Armstrong said, removing his military coat and removing his metal gauntlets. Naruto let out a sigh. "Are we going to fight, really?" Naruto asked in a tired, sounding voice. With his coat resting a few feet behind him, Armstrong completed strapping his gauntlets on and let his arms hang by his sides. "That decision is up to you," replied Armstrong. "Should you join, there will be no need to fight." "Is there any chance you won't tell?" Naruto asked. "Unfortunately not," Armstrong said, "because you pose a significant risk to Amestris as you are. You could kill a lot of people, move quickly, and cause blindness based on what you showed me. Furthermore, you are not an Amestris citizen. You are not loyal to her people or to Amestris. Perhaps Amestris will declare war on Konohagakure one day, and nobody will be aware of it or ready for someone who can kill, blind, and evade large numbers of people. I would consider you a friend because I like you, but I have a duty to do this. For the final time, please think again. I want to avoid hurting a friend." Naruto let out a sigh. "I apologize, but as you stated, I am a man capable of killing, avoiding, and blinding large numbers of people. I would be used as a weapon to fight for control of the entire known world if I enlisted in your military. How many lives would be lost, Armstrong?" Naruto raised his hand, and a tiny, blue sphere the size of a marble appeared floating over his palm, quickly expanding to the size of a large softball. The sphere's exterior was tinted red, and its translucent blades gave it the appearance of a deranged, bladed windmill. "What's that?" Enthralled by the red orb, Armstrong asked. The first stage of one of my most destructive techniques, Naruto responded, pressing the orb back into its original marble-sized shape with his closed hand. How damaging is that? Armstrong asked. With a grim laugh, Naruto closed his fist and scattered the tiny orb. It could easily wipe out the majority of this mountain if fully formed. Unfortunately, I am unable to do so at this time, Naruto sighed. Why? In an attempt to persuade Naruto to join Amestris, Armstrong asked. Much of my power has been lost due to extremely unusual circumstances. Activities that used to be child's play for my people now put a lot of strain on my body, and I've been unable to perform as I once could. Naruto sighed once more. We could assist you. Amestris has some of the best medical facilities in the world. We might be able to help you get back on your feet, Armstrong begged. Naruto grimaced as he laughed, fatigue visible in his eyes. Armstrong, Naruto said, removing his conical hat and bowing. You really are a good man, and I wish we didn't have to meet. But I won't be Amestris's catalyst for war, and if it means removing you from the picture, then so be it. Armstrong nodded, his features hardening and his body stiffening. Naruto assumed a fighting stance and put his hat back on his head. Before we begin, Naruto said, tilting his hat forward so Armstrong could not see his face. Do you have any unresolved issues, regrets, or unfulfilled goals? Not liking the implication of Naruto's question, Armstrong scowled. Armstrong raised his gauntlets in a traditional pugilist stance and said, I have only 2 regrets. That I couldn't get you to join, and that I could never earn my sister's respect. Naruto gave a nod. I'm grateful. While I will not join Amestris's military, I will try to win your sister's respect in your place, Naruto said, raising his head to reveal to Armstrong a startling sight. Deep purple eyes in place of Naruto's piercing blue ones, and even more startling was the presence of a single, strange-looking black circlet around the pupil. Armstrong hesitated for a moment before shaking his head and inhaling deeply. With that thought in mind, Armstrong rushed forward, bringing himself within a second of Naruto. Well, he thought, if I die, at least it will be at the hands of a worthy opponent. When he got to Naruto, he raised his fist in an attempt to slam it down on him, but Naruto remained motionless. Just as Armstrong's fist was about to strike Naruto's head, Naruto moved forward, getting into Armstrong's guard, and Armstrong, still focused on his first blow, was unable to move as Naruto's hand reached up and grasped his forehead. Armstrong didn't even have a moment to be perplexed before Naruto's eyes brightened. Sorry, Naruto said. Then, with red light gleaming from his fingertips, Naruto dug his fingers into Armstrong's face before removing his hand from his head, the red light briefly glimmering before fading to nothing. As soon as Armstrong's body went limp, it fell face first into the grass and onto Naruto, who ducked out of the way. Veins began to swell all over Naruto's body as too much energy surged through his chakra pathways, and he gasped, apparently in excruciating pain, as he clutched his head with his free hand. Naruto shook his head, as though he had a fly constantly buzzing around his ears that wouldn't go away, and staggered to the tree he had been sitting at before Armstrong had risen. He rubbed his hand over his temple as the purple hue in his eyes faded and the typical blue returned to the surface. Shut up, Naruto whispered, shaking his head. It had to be done, he said, leaning off the tree as he approached Armstrong's body and looked down at the massive man. You're supposed to be locked away, Naruto said, speaking to himself once more. He kneeled next to Armstrong's body and placed the small red scroll on the ground next to the massive mass. He reached forward and placed his hand on Armstrong's neck, looking for signs of a pulse. After a moment, he pulled his hand away, sighed, and unraveled the scroll so that it was parallel to Armstrong's body. There were numerous circles that resembled transmutation arrays along the scroll, but instead of mathematical numbers and polygons, there were kanji. Naruto reached forward, grabbed the larger man's shoulder, and flipped Armstrong onto his back so that he was lying across the scroll. He then reached into his coat and took out a penknife, placing it on Armstrong's abdomen, but before he could do anything more, he flinched. Are you thinking of something better? As the one-sided conversation he was having with himself continued, Naruto asked, shook his head, then sank the penknife into Armstrong's flesh and began to make inscriptions into Armstrong's abdominal area. After a while, the cuts began to take shape and eventually mirrored the seal on the scroll Armstrong's body was lying on. When he was done, he took his knife and wiped it on Armstrong's pants before reviewing his work. Satisfied, Naruto put his knife in his coat and then placed his hand on the middle of Armstrong's abdomen. A moment later, the scroll glowed blue, and a mass of smoke covered Armstrong's body. When the smoke dispersed, the only thing left was the scroll, with the seal glowing red. Looking at Armstrong's blue military overcoat, Naruto rolled up the scroll, tucked it into his coat, and walked up to it before sighing and pointing his remaining hand in front of him with his middle and index fingers up. The only indication that anything was happening was a tiny puff of smoke, and a perfect replica of Naruto materialized beside the original without a sound. Naruto glanced at his clone before throwing the copy Armstrong's coat. The clone silently put its hand in front of itself, just like Naruto did when he created the clone. A moment later, a puff of smoke surrounded the clone, and when the smoke cleared, an exact replica of a shirtless Armstrong stood in its place. The clone put on Armstrong's coat, moving around and getting a feel for the item of clothing. Naruto reached into his own black cloak and threw the scroll containing Armstrong's body to his clone, who easily caught it before saluting Naruto and heading down the hill toward Resembul's train station. After a moment, Naruto's body relaxed as his consciousness left him and he entered his mind for the first time in more than 400 years. Naruto watched as the false Armstrong vanished down the mountain, then sighed and walked back to the tree, sitting down at its base, folding his legs in a meditative position, closing his eyes, steadying his breathing, and concentrating on his body.
So that's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the channel for more awesome stories like this. Thank you. See you all in my next video.